The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch as Thomas Lone McKenna adjusted his weathered hat and surveyed the cattle scattered across the vast Texas plains. At 43, his face bore the lines of countless seasons under the merciless frontier sun, each wrinkle telling a story of survival in the unforgiving wilderness of 1822. He had worked for Jeremiah Blackwood's ranch for nearly 15 years, earning a reputation as the most reliable cowman in 3 counties, a man who never questioned orders and never failed to deliver. But this morning would test that unwavering loyalty in ways he never imagined. "McKenna!" Blackwood's voice boomed across the corral, sharp as a whip crack. The ranch owner strode toward him, his expensive boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each determined step. Behind him followed his foreman, Pete Garrison, whose cruel smile always made the other ranch hands nervous. Lone tipped his hat respectfully. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood. What can I do for you?" Blackwood's steel-gray eyes were harder than usual as he gestured toward the far pasture. "There's a sick calf in the north pen, spotted fever by the looks of it. You know what that means." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority that had built his empire from nothing. Lone's stomach tightened. He'd seen spotted fever before. It could spread through a herd like wildfire, destroying everything a rancher had worked for. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Good." Blackwood's weathered hand rested on his gun belt. "I want that animal put down immediately, and the pen disinfected with lye. Can't risk it spreading to the rest of the herd. My livelihood depends on these cattle, McKenna. Every last head represents my family's future." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Lone had carried out such orders before. It was part of ranch life, the harsh reality of survival on the frontier. But something in Blackwood's tone, something in the way the morning light caught the desperation behind his authoritative facade, made this feel different. "The calf's barely 3 days old, sir," Lone said quietly, immediately regretting the words as they left his mouth. Blackwood's eyes flashed dangerously. "Are you questioning my judgment, McKenna? That calf is a threat to every animal on this ranch. I've got 200 head of prime cattle, and I won't lose them because of one sick animal. You've been with me long enough to know how this works." Garrison stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "Want me to handle it, boss? McKenna seems to be getting soft in his old age." "No," Blackwood said firmly, his gaze never leaving Lone's face. "McKenna's my most trusted man. He'll do what needs to be done. Won't you, McKenna?" The weight of 15 years of loyalty pressed down on Lone's shoulders. He thought of his small cabin on the edge of the property, the steady wages that kept him fed and sheltered, the respect he'd earned among the other ranch hands. Everything he'd built could disappear with a single word of defiance. But then he thought of the calf, barely able to stand, its large brown eyes filled with an innocence that reminded him of his own childhood, when his grandfather had taught him that every life had value, even in the harsh wilderness. "I'll take care of it, Mr. Blackwood," Lone said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Good man." Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "I know it's not easy, but it's necessary. Sometimes we have to make hard choices to protect what matters most. My son Daniel's future depends on this ranch thriving. I won't let sentiment destroy what I've built for him." As Blackwood and Garrison walked away, Lone stood alone in the morning silence, the weight of his promise heavy as iron shackles. He looked toward the north pen where the sick calf waited, unaware that its fate hung in the balance of one man's conscience. The sun climbed higher, and with each passing moment, Lone felt the familiar certainty of his world beginning to crack. For 15 years, he'd been the perfect employee, loyal, dependable, unquestioning. But as he walked toward the north pen, his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes, boy, doing what's right ain't the same as doing what you're told." The calf lay in the corner of the pen, its breathing labored but steady. When it saw Lone approaching, it tried to stand, wobbling on unsteady legs. Its mother had been moved to another pasture, leaving the young animal alone and vulnerable. Lone knelt beside the calf, running his weathered hand along its spotted coat. The fever was there, but the animal's eyes were clear, alert. With the right care, the right medicine, it might survive. His grandfather had taught him about healing herbs, about the old ways of treating sick animals that didn't always require a bullet. But Blackwood's orders were clear, and defying them would mean losing everything he'd worked for. The choice before him would define not just his future, but the kind of man he truly was beneath the loyal facade he'd worn for so long. The rifle felt heavier than usual in Lone's weathered hands as he stood over the sick calf. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the empty pen. In the distance, he could hear the other ranch hands going about their daily routines, unaware of the moral battle raging in their colleague's heart. The calf looked up at him with trusting eyes, still trying to stand despite its weakened state. Lone had seen that look before, in the eyes of wounded soldiers during his brief stint in the territorial militia, in the faces of abandoned children in frontier towns. It was the look of something innocent and helpless, depending entirely on the mercy of others. "I'm sorry, little one," he whispered, raising the rifle. His finger found the trigger, but something deep in his chest rebelled against the action. The calf made a soft lowing sound, almost like a plea. Lone lowered the weapon, his hands trembling slightly. In that moment, he heard his grandfather's voice as clearly as if the old man were standing beside him. "A man's true character ain't measured by how well he follows orders, Tommy. It's measured by what he does when nobody's watching and his conscience is the only witness." Looking around to ensure he was alone, Lone made a decision that would change everything. Instead of ending the calf's life, he scooped the animal into his arms. The calf was heavier than expected, but Lone's years of ranch work had kept him strong. He carried it quickly toward the back of the property, where an old abandoned line shack sat hidden among a grove of cottonwood trees. The shack had been unused for years, forgotten by everyone except Lone, who sometimes retreated there when he needed solitude. It would be the perfect place to hide the calf while he nursed it back to health, if such a thing was even possible. Over the next several hours, Lone worked frantically to create a believable scene. He fired his rifle into a pile of hay, creating the sound that anyone listening would expect to hear. He gathered some of the calf's blood from where it had lain sick and spread it around the pen, making it appear as though he'd carried out Blackwood's orders. Then he thoroughly cleaned and disinfected the area with lye, just as instructed. When Garrison came to inspect his work later that afternoon, Lone's performance was flawless. "All done?" Garrison asked, his cold eyes scanning the empty pen. "Yes, sir. Burned the carcass in the back ravine, just like always. Pen's been disinfected twice." Lone's voice remained steady, though inside he felt like a traitor to everything he'd stood for. Garrison nodded approvingly. "Good. Blackwood will be pleased. Can't have diseased animals threatening the herd." He paused, studying Lone's face. "You did the right thing, McKenna. I know it ain't easy, but sometimes mercy is a luxury we can't afford out here." That evening, after the other hands had settled in for the night, Lone made his way to the hidden shack. The calf was weaker than before, its breathing shallow and labored. Using knowledge passed down from his grandfather, Lone began treating the animal with a mixture of wild herbs he'd gathered from the prairie, willow bark for the fever, echinacea for infection, and other remedies that frontier folk had relied on for generations. For 3 weeks, Lone lived a double life. By day, he performed his duties as Blackwood's most trusted cowman, maintaining the facade of loyalty and competence that had defined his reputation. By night, he became a secret healer, nursing the calf back to health with a dedication that surprised even himself. The animal responded slowly but steadily to his care. Its fever broke after the first week, and by the 3rd week, it was standing and walking with increasing strength. Lone had to supplement its diet with milk from his own small cow, a sacrifice that left him eating simpler meals, but filled him with a satisfaction he'd never experienced in 15 years of following orders. But secrets have a way of demanding payment, and Lone's deception was about to exact a price he never anticipated. It was Garrison who discovered the truth. The foreman had been suspicious of Lone's recent behavior, the way he'd been slipping away after dark, the exhaustion that showed in his face each morning. the small inconsistencies in his usual routine. Following him one night, Garrison witnessed Lone feeding and caring for the very animal that should have been dead and buried. The confrontation came at dawn, with Blackwood himself standing in the doorway of the line shack, his face a mask of betrayal and rage. Behind him, Garrison wore the satisfied smile of a man whose suspicions had been vindicated. 15 years, Blackwood said quietly, his voice more dangerous in its restraint than any shouting could have been. 15 years of trust, McKenna. And this is how you repay it? The calf, now healthy and strong, stood beside Lone as if sensing the tension in the air. Its coat had filled out, its eyes were bright and alert, and it moved with the confident grace of a young animal in perfect health. "Mr. Blackwood, I can explain," Lone began. "Explain?" Blackwood's voice rose slightly. "Explain how my most trusted employee directly disobeyed my orders? Explain how you lied to my face for 3 weeks? Explain how you risked my entire herd for one worthless animal?" The words hit Lone like physical blows, but he stood his ground. "The calf was never a real threat, sir. With proper care, spotted fever can be treated. You couldn't just follow orders." Blackwood's composure finally cracked. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The trust you've destroyed? I have a son, McKenna. Everything I do, every decision I make, is to secure his future. And you betrayed that for a sick animal." Lone looked at the healthy calf beside him, then back at his former employer. "Sometimes doing what's right means more than following orders, Mr. Blackwood. This animal deserved a chance to live." "Get off my land," Blackwood said coldly. "Take your precious calf and get out. If I see you anywhere near my property again, I'll have you arrested for theft. You're finished in this county, McKenna. No one will hire a man who can't be trusted to follow simple orders." As Lone led the calf away from the only home he'd known for 15 years, he carried with him more than just his few possessions. He carried the weight of a choice that had cost him everything he'd built, but had saved something he couldn't put a price on: his own soul. 5 years had passed since Lone McKenna walked away from Blackwood's ranch, leading a healthy calf into an uncertain future. The frontier had a way of swallowing men whole, but Lone had survived by adapting to a life he never could have imagined during his years as a trusted ranch hand. He'd become a ghost of the plains, a wandering cowman who took temporary work where he could find it, never staying long enough for his reputation to catch up with him. The calf, now a magnificent bull with a distinctive spotted coat and intelligent eyes, had grown into something of a legend himself. Ranch hands across 3 territories whispered stories of the mysterious cowman and his extraordinary bull, though few knew the true story behind their partnership. Lone had named the bull Redemption, partly as a reminder of the choice that had changed both their lives, and partly because the animal had indeed redeemed something in Lone's spirit that he'd thought was lost forever. Redemption had grown larger and stronger than any bull Lone had ever seen, with an unusual intelligence and an almost supernatural ability to sense danger and navigate difficult terrain. They'd saved 3 different ranches from stampedes, pulled countless wagons from mud and quicksand, and helped track down rustlers who thought they could disappear into the vast wilderness. Each time, Lone would accept minimal payment and move on before questions could be asked about his past or his remarkable animal. But the frontier was smaller than it seemed, and eventually, all paths led back to where they began. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October. Lone and Redemption had been traveling toward a small settlement where he'd heard there might be work, when the sky opened up with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Rain fell in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet, and lightning split the darkness with blinding intensity. Seeking shelter, they made their way toward a familiar ridge, one that Lone recognized with a mixture of dread and irony. They were less than 5 miles from Blackwood's ranch, closer to his old life than he'd been since the day he'd been banished. The sound that cut through the storm was unmistakable, a man's voice, raw with desperation and terror, calling for help. Lone's first instinct was to ride away, to avoid any possibility of encountering his former employer. but the voice carried a note of such anguish that his conscience wouldn't allow him to ignore it. Following the sound through the driving rain, Lone and Redemption came upon a scene that stopped his heart. A wagon had skidded off the muddy trail and tumbled down a steep embankment, coming to rest against a cluster of boulders. The vehicle was badly damaged, and trapped beneath it, Lone could see the still form of a young man. Standing in the rain, frantically trying to lift the wagon with his bare hands, was Jeremiah Blackwood. The powerful ranch owner looked older than his years, his hair now completely gray, his face etched with lines of worry and desperation. His expensive clothes were torn and muddy, and his hands were bleeding from his futile attempts to free the trapped victim. "Help!" Blackwood cried out when he saw the shadowy figures approaching through the storm. "Please, my son is trapped. I can't lift it alone." Lone's breath caught in his throat. The young man trapped beneath the wagon was Daniel Blackwood, the son for whom Jeremiah had built his empire, the future that had justified every harsh decision and ruthless order. Daniel would be about 22 now, Lone calculated, just beginning to take over the family business. For a moment, Lone hesitated. This was the man who had destroyed his reputation, who had cast him out for showing mercy to a sick animal. Justice might demand that he simply ride away, leaving Blackwood to face the consequences of his own choices. But as Lone looked at the desperate father and the trapped son, he saw not the harsh ranch owner who had banished him, but simply a man facing the possible loss of everything that mattered to him. And in that moment, Lone understood that true redemption wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about choosing mercy, even when it wasn't deserved. "Redemption," Lone called to his bull, dismounting quickly. "We've got work to do." The massive bull seemed to understand immediately. Moving with surprising grace for such a large animal, Redemption positioned himself next to the overturned wagon. Lone quickly fashioned a harness from rope, securing it around the bull's powerful shoulders and attaching it to the wagon's frame. Blackwood looked up in shock as he recognized the man who had come to his aid. "McKenna? Is that... How did you..." "Questions later," Lone said grimly, checking the harness connections. "Your son's running out of time." Working together in the driving rain, the two men guided Redemption as the bull strained against the weight of the wagon. The animal's muscles bulged with effort, his hooves digging deep furrows in the muddy ground. Slowly, incredibly, the wagon began to lift. "Now!" Lone shouted over the storm. "Pull him out!" Blackwood dove forward, grasping his son under the arms and dragging him clear, just as Redemption's strength began to give out and the wagon settled back into place. Daniel was unconscious, but breathing, his leg clearly broken but his pulse strong and steady. As Lone worked to stabilize the young man's injuries using skills learned during years of frontier survival, Blackwood stared at the bull that had just saved his son's life. Even in the darkness and rain, the animal's distinctive spotted coat was unmistakable. "That's the calf," Blackwood whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "The sick calf I ordered you to kill. That's him, isn't it?" Lone looked up from bandaging Daniel's leg, rain streaming down his weathered face. "His name is Redemption. And yes, he's the calf you wanted dead. The calf whose life you thought was worthless." The irony wasn't lost on either man. The animal that Blackwood had condemned to death had just saved the life of his only son, the very future that Blackwood had claimed to be protecting with his harsh order 5 years earlier. As they worked together to get Daniel to safety, both men were forced to confront the weight of choices made and prices paid. The storm raged around them, but in the space between lightning strikes, something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between the exile and the man who had cast him out. 3 days after the storm, Daniel Blackwood lay recovering in his father's ranch house, his broken leg set and splinted by the town doctor. The young man would heal completely, the doctor had assured them, though he'd carry a slight limp as a permanent reminder of how close he'd come to death on that rain-soaked ridge. Lone McKenna sat on the porch of the main house, a cup of coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. It felt strange to be back on Blackwood's property after 5 years of exile, stranger still to be welcomed as a hero rather than scorned as a traitor. Redemption grazed peacefully in the pasture nearby, seemingly unbothered by the attention he'd been receiving from the ranch hands, all of whom had heard the story of the magnificent bull who'd saved the boss's son. Jeremiah Blackwood emerged from the house, moving slowly like a man who'd aged years in a matter of days. He settled into the chair beside Lone, and for several minutes the two men sat in silence, watching the sun set over the vast Texas plains. "The doctor says Daniel will make a full recovery," Blackwood said finally. "Thanks to you, and to—" He paused, struggling with the words, "to redemption." Lone nodded but said nothing. The weight of unspoken history hung between them like a physical presence. "I owe you an explanation," Blackwood continued, his voice heavy with something Lone had never heard from him before. Humility. About what happened 5 years ago. About why I was so harsh. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Blackwood. I disobeyed your orders. I knew the consequences." Blackwood shook his head. "You don't understand. It wasn't just about the calf, McKenna. It was about fear." He paused, staring out at the horizon. "My first wife died giving birth to Daniel. For years, it was just him and me against the world. Every decision I made, every harsh order I gave, was driven by the terror of losing him too. I convinced myself that sentiment was weakness, that mercy was a luxury I couldn't afford." Lone turned to study his former employer's profile, seeing the pain etched in every line of the older man's face. "When you defied my order about that calf," Blackwood continued, "it wasn't just disobedience I saw. It was a challenge to everything I'd built my life around. The idea that there might be another way, a gentler way, terrified me more than any stampede or drought ever could." "And now?" Lone asked quietly. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. "Now I know that the very thing I tried to destroy, your capacity for mercy, is what saved my son's life. The calf I wanted dead grew up to be the bull that pulled Daniel from certain death. If that's not divine justice, I don't know what is." From inside the house came the sound of Daniel's voice, weak but cheerful, talking with one of the ranch hands who'd come to check on him. The sound seemed to give Blackwood strength. "I want to make you an offer, McKenna," he said, turning to face Lone directly. "I want you to come back, not as a hired hand, but as my partner. Half ownership in the ranch, full authority to make decisions about the cattle and the land. I'm getting old, and Daniel's got years of learning ahead of him before he's ready to take over. I need someone I can trust, someone who understands that sometimes the hardest choices aren't about following orders, but about knowing when to break them." The offer hung in the air between them, more generous than Lone could have imagined in his wildest dreams. Half ownership of one of the most successful ranches in Texas would mean security, respect, a future he'd never dared hope for during his years of exile. But Lone found himself thinking not of the wealth or status the offer represented, but of the 5 years he'd spent wandering the frontier with redemption. They'd been hard years, uncertain years, but they'd also been honest years. He'd learned to trust his own judgment, to follow his conscience, even when it led him down difficult paths. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Blackwood," Lone said slowly. "More generous than I deserve. You saved my son's life. You deserve whatever I can give you." Lone stood up, walking to the porch railing where he could see redemption grazing in the fading light. The bull looked up as if sensing his attention, their eyes meeting across the distance. In that moment, Lone understood something that had taken him 5 years to learn. "I can't accept your offer," he said finally, turning back to Blackwood. "Not because I don't appreciate it, but because I've learned something these past 5 years. I've learned that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns or who he works for. It's measured by whether he can look at himself in the mirror and respect what he sees." Blackwood's face fell, but Lone continued before he could speak. "But I will accept something else if you're willing to offer it. I'll accept your friendship, your respect, and maybe, when you're faced with hard choices in the future, you'll remember that sometimes mercy isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing a man can choose." Understanding dawned in Blackwood's eyes. "You're leaving again. Redemption and we've got our own path to follow. There are other people out there who might need help, other animals that might need saving. We've found our purpose, and it's not tied to any one place or any one man's approval. Blackwood stood as well, extending his hand. Then let me offer you something else. Whenever you need supplies, shelter, or just a place to rest, you'll always be welcome here. And if you ever change your mind about that partnership, Lone shook the offered hand firmly. I appreciate that, Mr. Blackwood. More than you know. As the two men stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Daniel Blackwood appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. Mr. McKenna, the young man said, his voice still weak but determined. I wanted to thank you before you left, and to ask you something. Lone turned to face the son he'd helped save. What's that, son? Teach me, Daniel said simply. Not about ranching. My father can do that. But teach me about making the hard choices, about knowing when to follow orders and when to follow your conscience. I have a feeling I'm going to need that wisdom someday. Lone smiled, seeing in the young man's eyes the same spark of moral courage that had driven him to save a sick calf 5 years earlier. The most important lesson I can teach you is this. When you're faced with a choice between what's easy and what's right, always choose what's right. Even if it costs you everything you think you want, it'll give you something more valuable, the ability to live with yourself. The next morning, as Lone McKenna and Redemption disappeared into the vast expanse of the Texas frontier, they left behind more than just grateful friends. They left behind a legacy, proof that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come not from following orders, but from having the courage to break them when conscience demands it. And in the years that followed, whenever ranch hands gathered around campfires to share stories of the frontier, they would speak of the lone cowman and his remarkable bull, who proved that mercy, once given freely, has a way of returning when it's needed most. The sick calf that was meant to die had grown up to save a life, just as the cowman who'd been cast out for showing mercy had found his way back to redemption. In the end, both had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from following the rules, but from knowing when to break them in service of something higher. Hello, how are you? Did you like the story? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.